This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Over 5 decades ago, martial artist and actor Bruce Lee died suddenly at age 32, yet his status as a pop culture icon has continued to grow. Much of that comes from what he did on camera. Lee introduced U.S. audiences to Chinese kung fu as Kato in the TV series The Green Hornet. Through films of the early 1970s like The Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon, Lee challenged stereotypes about Asian meekness, and that made him relatable to all manner of audiences who understood what it meant to defy stereotypes in real life. Bruce Lee was also a deeply philosophical thinker. He believed martial arts were more than a physical discipline. They were a metaphor for living a fully realized life. So when he passed in 1973, he left a trove of writings full of principles for such living. The 2020 book, Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee, written by Lee's daughter Shannon Lee, shares those principles. At an event co-sponsored by the Very Asian Foundation, the Bruce Lee Foundation, and Left Bank Books, I had the pleasure of speaking with Shannon about the book and her father's legacy at the Duane Reed Gallery in St. Louis. And so, for today, we'll bring you that conversation, recorded on location. So, Shannon, this book, Be Water, My Friend, it was published in October of 2020. Who were you writing it for, and what did it feel like to publish it during a global pandemic?
Yes, well, the publishing of it during a global pandemic was certainly not planned. In the opening of the book, it is dedicated to my father, it's dedicated to my daughter, and it's dedicated to you. And that is who I wrote it for, really. I mean, I wrote it for you. And the reason that I wrote it is because my father's teachings, his philosophies, have healed me and inspired me and motivated me. And because I have had the benefit of that, I wanted everyone else to have that benefit as well. And I wanted people to know my father in this way, as a philosopher, as a deep thinker. Because everybody knows, the kung fu and the films, which are awesome. But the impact, the global impact that he was able to make is because of the deep personal work that he did. So that is something that we can all do. And so I wanted to, do this for him, to introduce him in a deeper way to whoever would pick up the book. And then also for my daughter, because this is part of her legacy. And then also for anyone to benefit from, should you choose to read it. So the pandemic part was a little difficult. I mean, also October, if you remember, was right before the election. So pandemic, election, it was a very chaotic time. I couldn't promote the book because of the pandemic, like out in the public. But I do feel like the book was in some ways a bit of a balm for that moment. And that it has found its way out into the world.
So, in talking with people and hearing from them, how have they found their way to this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it seems to be in part, obviously, through, we promote it through our Bruce Lee channels. We have 44 million fans and followers on social media. We sell it in our store online. So that's been one obvious and natural pathway. But interestingly enough, it seems to have just started to seep into the consciousness and word of mouth. I mean, I was a little concerned that on the cover it says, Be Water, My Friend, the teachings of Bruce Lee. And I'm like, should it say like philosophical teachings or life teachings? Because I didn't want people to think it was a martial arts book. And so, in that sense, I was like, well, I hope it really finds the audience, because you don't have to be a martial artist or a Bruce Lee fan, even, to enjoy and be able to ingest this book. And so it seems to me like it's just finding its way. I mean, I have people that are teaching it in some high schools now and in some universities. So I'm really humbled and feel extremely honored that it has seemed to, like water, found its way.
Right. So I did not know about this book until this opportunity to speak with you and with you all came up. I actually listened to the audiobook, and you do such a great job. It's very soothing, will not put you to sleep. It is invigorating, and I have a son who is going to be 8 in just a couple weeks, and he has asked to listen to it. He's enjoying it too, so to the point that you've made about your daughter, about kids in school, it really is, it's written in such an accessible way, but not manufactured as that. It really feels naturally like that, flowing like water, perhaps.
Thank you. It was my intention for it to be accessible. My father's words, as many of you who are probably fans know, are beautiful, and you listen to them, and you hear the water quote, or you hear him talk about, in interviews, like unnatural naturalness and all this sort of stuff, which is amazing. But sometimes it needs a little explanation, right?
Yes.
So this was my attempt at that.
Something that I wondered about as I was reading it is the way that you alternate between titles and names. So you say, my father, you say Bruce Lee, you say Bruce, you say Baba, you say my dad. Why?
Well, those are all the ways that I know him and talk about him. And, sometimes I find it's worthwhile, even though it's strange because he is my father. Most people just say my father, or my dad, or, Baba is Cantonese for father, which is what I called him when I was little. But sometimes it's useful to say Bruce Lee, to remind the reader, or to, depending on what I'm talking about, to like create that connection of his iconography, And so, and for readers, because they're reading about him, to connect to his name sometimes. So if I'm always just saying my father, at some point you might be like, wait, who? And, the Chinese side of me calls him Baba, that's my like sweet personal childhood connection to him. Out in the world, he's my dad, and maybe a little more formally, my father.
This book, it was preceded by a podcast series. And I was listening to some of that in preparation for today. And one of the things I wondered about is the difference between talking about your father and his philosophical ideals, and then writing about them, and then what that experience was for you. So in the writing of this book, were there things that were revealed about your father and yourself as you were committing words to paper?
Yes, for sure. I am very grateful for the amount of time that I had to write the book. I took about a year to write it, and then, for anyone not familiar with the publishing process, there's quite a lengthy editing phase that happens of several months. And I was very grateful for that as well, because, I I host the Bruce Lee podcast. And when you're talking, it's very natural, it's very in the moment. It's not the way that you want to write necessarily. And whenever I read an article that's like a transcription of my words, I'm like, oh God, that sound awful. But that is something you're listening in on. It's a different experience. When you're writing, you really want to be clear. You really want to take a reader on a journey. I'm always in my writing tapping into my feeling as I write. How does this feel as I'm writing? Does it feel like it's, expressing well, or communicating effectively, or creating some emotional connection? I was really grateful for the length of time because I changed in that time. And this connection is so personal to me that as I'm trying to express what these philosophies mean to me, I'm changing at the same time. And during that process, I was like, oh, what I just had this realization. I need to put that in the book, which is also the scary part about publishing a book. Is that you're like, oh God, now it's done, it's concluded, and I can't change it anymore. But it's a dance. It's a dance, and writing is a dance, and it's also sometimes a battle, a little struggle to be clear. And I know, when I first turned in the manuscript, my editor came back and said, I'm not really sure what you're meaning here or here, and I revised and actually added a chapter to the book. So I was really grateful for that process.
Well, it sounds like it was a process that very much mirrors what we are supposed to be doing.
Yes.
What states of water did you find yourself in most as you were writing?
Sometimes very much in flow, and sometimes very much like a single drop trying to carve a passage through a mountain.
What did you do in those times did you fight it sometimes? How did you get through those?
I find that a change of scenery, and this is really good advice for anything, but just getting up, going outside, stopping, changing your scenery, changing also your inner state, breathing, taking a moment, working on something else for a little while. I am a person who really enjoys the art of contemplation. This sense of holding something kind of off to the side or in the back of my mind while I'm going about my day and letting it disentangle and evolve and expand on its own. So getting out and having that change of scenery, going for a walk, doing something else for a little while is very helpful because I'm not really leaving it. It's still here, right? But I'm also getting an opportunity to shift, it says in the book, all our one of my father's quotes is like, all or most or all of our problems can be solved with a simple shift in perspective. So I put that to practice.
Yeah. Simple meaning that it's a simple move, not that the process itself is simple.
Yeah, well, if you practice it, it can become simple, which I think is another lesson of his, which is anything new that you undertake, you're not familiar with it. You don't know this process, so it can be challenging, right? And you have to practice. You have to practice whatever that is, whatever you're trying to do, until at some point it starts to flow and become a little bit more like second nature. Mm-hmm. And you start to learn that when you hit these roadblocks, that it's not the end of the world, because that's the immediate thought, like, oh no, I'm stuck and I'm going to be stuck forever. And it's like, no, it's okay, you're stuck. That's what happens. Shift, change, flow around that obstacle as best you can.
We're listening to my conversation with Shannon Lee, recorded on location at the Duane Reed Gallery in the Central West End. Lee is the daughter of actor and martial artist Bruce Lee. The book she wrote is Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee. We'll get back to that conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Let's return to my conversation with Shannon Lee, author of Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee. She was in town in March for an event co-sponsored by the Very Asian Foundation, the Bruce Lee Foundation, and Left Bank Books.
Something that comes up fairly early in the book has to do with a symbol that I think it's misused a lot of the time and very much associated with anything that is East Asian, and it's the Yinyang. It is misunderstood, misapprehended by Western culture, and even for people who are not necessarily familiar with it now, wherever they're from. How was it that your father's approach to Yinyang, which is neither and nor versus, how is it different from the way that it gets talked about, especially in the Western world where we are living now?
Yes, well, as you say, most people say yin and yang, and it's really yin yang. There's no and in between. There's no break. It's not two separate things. It's one thing. And, it's often thought of as opposites. And that's how it's used. Oh, black and white, hot and cold, short and tall, But really, the yin-yang symbol represents wholeness. It represents totality. It represents the complements that make up the wholeness or the totality, right? So and that they cannot be separated. That's why you see one side is white or whatever color it happens to be, but white, and one side black, but they have the encapsulation of the other within. The circle is within. And so it's not something to be referenced as opposites, but complements to one another. And so it's like hot and cold, right? We tend to think of them in the West as opposites, but actually they are just two expressions of the totality of temperature. So when we think about the duality of this world that we live in and how polarizing it is, actually, it's not. We're just looking at the extremes of our nature in action. But really, as my father said, under the sky, under the heaven, we're one family. We're one family having a human experience, but we see ourselves as separate. And so the yin-yang is meant to represent that there is no separateness.
On that note, the chapter that I enjoyed most, I think, was the opponent chapter. And so this notion or understanding that there is no opponent, and the retelling that you have of Lao's time from Enter the Dragon, which I watched again, it's such a different way of thinking about how people are in relationship with one another. The context that we're in, we are in St. Louis. St. Louis is, in many ways, guided by or tied to the racial binary, black and white. There are black and white among us today. There are also Asian, East Asian, South Asian, but not sort of a group that is considered to be part of a whole. So as we think about what it means to think about things in opposition or together, what is the thing that that you have to say or that you think about when there is a third, and how that third becomes part of something that's so largely thought about as just two halves?
Now, that's interesting. Well, first of all, it's interesting that you brought up the opponent chapter, because I was just looking at that chapter last night, actually. And it's a chapter in the book called The Opponent. And my point being that everything that we are in relationship with, right, which is of all different expressions, whether they are people or whether it's our surroundings, our environment, is actually a reflection of us. Because we are experiencing it and reacting to it and responding to it. And how we relate and how we react is actually telling us and informing us about who we are. Not about who they are, about who we are. And so, my father says, a good Kung Fu man aims his blows, his punches, his kicks at himself, ultimately. Because that is what you need to break down your resistances to. And so, life is wild and varied. We tend to think of it in binary, but it is not, right? Even within our perceived binaries, there are all different, expressions and shades and variations of what that is. And so I guess what I would say is, it reminds me of another quote of my father's where he says, we are not to look at the separate parts, even if it's the separate parts of our lives, our family, our friends, our career, and to work on those things individually. We're actually to start with ourselves, work on how we want to be in the world, and then bring that to all the different parts, right? So if I want to be happy with my career or happy with my relationships, then I need to be happy so that I can bring that happiness to those things. And so I don't know if I'm answering the question specifically, but I guess my point is that we have to sort of consider that life is wild and beautiful. And we have to consider ourselves as part of that wildness and part of that beauty. And how do we want life to be reflected through us? And so it's sort of like we want to approach, and the last chapter is all about this too. If we can hold the initial response to the world as the world is my friend. The last chapter is called My Friend, because it's be water, my friend. And if we can face the world and interact with the world through that lens of the world is something that I can be in connection with in a friendly way. Now, it's not to say that unfriendly things don't happen, they do. But we don't want to start from that place. We want to actually be present to the experience that we are having without assumption and without expectation. And that's the wildness of it, and that's how we grow to include everything that is into our experience and stop experiencing life as a duality, as a binary.
Would you also say not experiencing it as a reaction?
As a reaction, right. Right, because, I think this book talks about, and it uses some martial arts analogies in it, just because sometimes physical examples can help us with sort of esoteric concepts. But the idea of being a martial artist, and I talk about this in the book, my father talked about the stages of cultivation. And he would say, in the beginning when you're a martial artist, a punch is just a punch. You're not a martial artist, you've never trained, someone says, throw a punch, and you go, and that's a punch, it is. But, you don't really know what you're doing, you don't know how to throw a punch accurately, you're just doing it. And similar to reaction in life, like you're out there, you're bumping into people are, somebody cuts you off, you're like, hey, like you're just reacting. You're just, I'm just throwing my punch. The second stage is you start to learn, you start to practice. Well, how do you throw a good punch, actually? Like, how should your stance be? How should you turn? How should you hold your fist? Is it better to be vertical? Is it better to be horizontal? Like, all of those things. And you have to practice. So then you start to look at yourself out in the world and you say, well, someone just cut me off. Have I ever cut off someone?
The knowing laughter.
Yeah. Right? Like, oh, well, maybe, that person was in a hurry or they weren't paying attention. Not great, but they weren't trying to do that to me. Right? So now I start to practice. Okay, I can calm myself. I can be in charge and learn how to control my responses in terms of how I want to feel in my body, in my life. Then you get to the third stage where a punch is just a punch again, but this time it's with skill. Now you're not having to throw a punch unless you really want to throw a punch. And that's where reaction becomes skilled response. And so same with ourselves out in the world, Now, instead, I get to decide, I get to choose how to respond from a place of, some practiced wisdom.
The chapter after the opponent is the tools. And in this chapter, you describe a poster that your father had, that you now have, and it has a couple of vultures. They are perched on a dead tree with nothing dead in front of them, i.e., there is nothing to eat. Can you describe that poster? And then I'll follow up after that.
So the poster, it's very 70s. It's got black light looking colors, and it's a cartoon drawing, two vultures on this dead tree. There's like a dead skull of an animal on the ground, and it's just a barren landscape. And one vulture is saying to the other vulture, patience my ass, I'm gonna kill something.
So thank you for setting that up. So my question is the Warrior series the kill that you were not willing to wait for?
The kill that I was not willing to wait for. That's an interesting question. It did wait for a long time. The Warrior TV show that I executive produced, that we created, is based on an idea that my father created in the 60s. He pitched it, couldn't get it made, was told a Chinese man could not star in a TV show at that time. And then, of course, years later, he passed, and this idea just sat in a box, and it took us 50 years to bring it to life. So, I mean, there was some patience happening there.
Yeah, sure. But once the moment came, I
Yeah.
mean, you have gone in
Yeah.
to glorious results.
Yes, and I have to say, there's something to be said because we've talked about flow, right? The book is about flow. There's something to be said about timing and naturalness. So it just so happened, and I really have to give a lot of props to Justin Lin, my producing partner on that show, who, as you know, is like this major filmmaker for Fast and Furious franchise and Star Trek and all these things. He came to me and said, I've always heard this story about this show that your father created. Is that a true story? And I said, yes. And he said, do you happen to know where that is? Do you have it? Yes, I have it right here. And so I showed it to him, and to his credit, he said, I would really love to make this. Would you want to make this? And I said, I would love nothing more. But he said, but if we make it, it has to be made right. Otherwise, we should not make it. And that is music to my ears, because everything that I do for my father, I do it out of love and service to his legacy and his energy. And so the show had to be right. It had to be able to be cast the way we wanted to cast it. The story, the reflections of the characters, the energy of it, it all had to be there. And so yes, I mean, we dove in at that at that point to try to do it. And anytime you make film or TV, I mean, it's a monumental task. The fact that any shows turn out well is always a shock to me, because it takes hundreds of people to bring this to fruition. So, so yes, I mean, we dove in and we did what we did, and we've been so proud of it, and we really love the show, and we are, all of us in the cast and crew, actually, truly a family. Like, through the ups and downs of this show, it's been canceled now twice, and we just keep believing in it and loving it, and the fans loving it, and we just keep sort of holding on and saying, like, we're just going to keep pushing. So yes, we're pushing.
Yeah.
You're listening to my conversation with Shannon Lee, author of Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee. By the way, the Warrior TV series that Shannon mentioned is a martial arts crime drama that debuted in 2019. It takes place during the Tang Wars in the late 1800s, and the central character is a martial arts prodigy from China who immigrates to the U.S. and joins a powerful secret society in San Francisco's Chinatown. As Shannon mentioned, it's been canceled twice, but fans remain hopeful about a possible fourth season. We'll get back to the conversation, recorded on location, after this short break. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to my conversation with Shannon Lee, author of Be Water, My Friend, The Teachings of Bruce Lee. She was in town recently for an event co-sponsored by the Very Asian Foundation, the Bruce Lee Foundation, and Left Bank Books.
So I will be very candid in that when I was first approached about talking with you about this book, I don't go in for self-help. That is not a genre that I find compelling, usually. And self-help and self-actualization, they do have negative connotations among some groups of people. But Be Water, My Friend was not a book that I would characterize as being self-help or self-actualization, like that as a term you use many times in the book. I mean, on that note, how do you describe the difference between being self-centered and self-grounded?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean, but when you say self-centered, do you mean the negative connotation of self-centered?
Yeah,
Okay.
because you do talk
Because
about
I'm like self-centered
centering.
and grounded are the same thing, but not if you're talking negatively.
Well, I mean, how are they the same? I
Yeah.
think it's worth teasing that out a little bit.
Yeah. This is where it gets a little difficult, okay? Because being someone who is focused on self can mean that you're selfish, or it can mean that you are practicing self-care, and and self-love, and personal growth, right? And sometimes it's very hard. Those things are very close to each other, and oftentimes influenced by others' perception of you, right? And I try to talk about this a bit in the book, give some examples. You know, when you are, I guess I would say that the clearest indication is, do you feel good in your being? So in your body and in your mind, because as we know, your mind is a huge challenge for all of us, because we all have those thoughts. I should be doing this, I didn't do that right, I wonder if this person's mad at me, you know, all of that stuff. If your mind is able to be directed in a positive way, and you feel pretty good in your body, then you're pretty grounded and centered. And if you are looping in your mind and having a lot of obsessive thoughts and trying to please too many people at once, or focused entirely on yourself as related to your external circumstances. I need people to like me, I need to have this much money, I need to have these things in order to be happy, then you are probably more balanced on the self-centered, self-obsessed side as you view yourself in the external world. Because, you know, the thing is, I always tell my daughter this. I'm like, here's the secret. Do you feel peaceful? Do you feel happy in your mind and in your body? If the answer is yes, more times than no, you're winning at life. Period. So, but that's an inside job. I mean, I'll give an example. I have this project that I've been working on, and I got paired with this producer who I find to be really challenging personality. And every time I would have to get on the phone with him, I'd be like, oh my God, oh, he's so frustrating, he's so this, he's so ba, 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 ba. And now I'm annoyed and not feeling good in myself. That has actually nothing to do with him. He's not making me feel that way. I'm allowing that. So I just, finally one day I was like, oh my God, this is not how I want to be. I don't want to be annoyed like this all the time. So I am just going to accept that that's who he is. That is who he is. And so when he does his thing that I find annoying, I can just be like, there he is doing that annoying thing again. You know? Yeah. And not take it on. It's not mine. It's not mine.
This is the part of the interview I'm going to be listening to over and over again. We're going to take a couple of the audience questions now.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to know, do you keep in touch with any of his students still at all?
I do keep in touch with my father's students. Many of them have passed. My father tended to be a little younger than most of his students. Not all. Dan Inosanto is still alive, and there are a handful that are still alive. But my father this year would be 84. So, but yes, I mean we have kept in touch, and they've been a part of my whole life.
Another audience member asked Shannon Lee what her father would think of the state of our society and referenced the earlier discussion about being in opposition to another.
I know he wouldn't be thrilled with the state of things, and I'm sure he would have done all he could to speak out on it. He was a person who just really wanted to treat each person that he encountered as they are, separate from anything having to do with their appearance, their background, their status, any of that, And I think the biggest lesson here, something that he mentions this in some of his quotes, it's like, when it comes to ego, you want to be able to use your ego rather than be used by your ego. And so when it comes to duality and polarization, the whole purpose of having this experience we're having right now is to learn from it. And, unfortunately, sometimes things have to get really bad in order for people to stand up and do something about it. And also to say, this is not the experience I want to be having in the world. And unfortunately, there are a lot of us all having our own experience, and we're at different stages of learning along that experience. And so it's going to take time for all of us to get there. But the idea is, rather than to be used by the duality, to be used by the polarization, to be pitted against one another, we want to use that experience to say, oh, this is not how I want to be. This is not how I wish we could all be in relationship to one another. I'm sure he would be talking about that. I'm sure he would not be happy. I mean, in the rise of Asian hate, he would have, in particular, really been unhappy about that as well. So, I wish there was something I could do to just like, hey, everybody. Maybe they could read my book. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
The final audience member question to Shannon Lee was how she wants to differentiate her own legacy from that of her father, the martial artist and actor Bruce Lee.
So this is one thing that I will say. Where my father and I really meet is in the philosophy and in the personal growth work, which is why writing this book, even though it's about his philosophy, is also about my experience. And I do a lot of work to learn and grow through all different modalities, including his own. And I find that so many of his quotes speak to me so deeply, even though I may have read them 1,000 times, depending on what I'm going through in a particular day, all of a sudden one will, grab me. And I have dedicated my life for the last 24 years to stewarding his legacy. And there's a lot of fun in that. And I am getting to a place in my life where I'm like, I want to do some projects that have nothing to do with Bruce Lee. But I have to say, I also love doing the Bruce Lee projects. It's really fun. And, when I first took over stewarding the legacy, I set up the license. I didn't right away set up the licensing business. When I first took over, the commercial use of my father's name and likeness was controlled by somebody else. And it took me 11 years to get that back. And then I had to set up a licensing business and to respond to all of those requests. And it was about 2 years ago that I said, okay, licensing is cool, t-shirts are cool and everything, but it's not really fulfilling to me as a human being. I really want to focus more on the Bruce Lee Foundation and being of service, and also on my creative projects, so film and TV production, but also writing. And little by little, you know, they always give the analogy of like turning a giant ocean liner. It doesn't turn at like immediate right angles. So I'm like slowly guiding this ship in that direction. And I just know of myself, I love to be creative. I find running a business to be a creative act. I find life to be a creative act. And so as long as my creativity is being fed, and I am putting myself out there that in sort of risky and uncomfortable ways so that I can learn and grow, then I'm being me. But there are more things coming, yes. I will say, I have not been promoting this, but I did start my own website called leewaymedia.com. So if you want to check out what that is, you can. And I'm going to be launching a separate podcast as well soon. And I'm working on some other writing projects too. Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking.
In a very short answer.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm verbose.
Kung Fu is not just one thing. It's not just martial art. What is your Kung Fu?
Ooh. So for those who don't know, the literal translation of Kung Fu is any skill acquired through hard work. We use it in reference to martial arts. But you can have great Kung Fu in anything, you know? You can have great accounting Kung Fu. I do not. I'm not a math person. What is my Kung Fu? That is a good question. I think I have some creativity Kung Fu. I think I have some I think I have some relationship Kung Fu in a general sense. Some people might say I don't because I'm not in a relationship. But that is not the only measure. But just, I mean, in relating to people and hopefully, you know, trying to have a compassionate stance of understanding that we're all in our own process. We're just at different points in the process, you know? So if I'm having difficulty in relationship, it's because we see things differently. So maybe it's that I have some Kung Fu and the ability to see things from other perspectives.
Would you agree? That's her Kung Fu? Yes. Shannon Lee, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Oh my gosh, I could talk forever, as I'm sure you could see. But thank you. Yeah.
This episode was produced and edited by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer. Recorded and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show.
Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.